All right. Hello there, AP Eurobears. In this recorded slideshow lecture, we are going to learn about the 30 Years' War. This was a catastrophic event which did in fact last exactly 30 years. It drew in nearly every powerful country in Europe, with the exception of England, although there were plenty of people from the British Isles who went to serve as mercenaries during the 30 Years' War. And the 30 Years' War, because it was such a catastrophe in Central Europe, it will have an incredible ripple effect throughout history. I will dedicate some time at the end of this lecture talking about some of the long-term consequences of this war. But there were a great many consequences to the 30 Years' War, and as I go through the entirety of AP European history, or as I go through the entirety of European history for our AP Euro class, I may be referring back to the 30 Years' War, since there was so much that came out of it. All right, if you look in any European history textbook or any AP Euro review book, and you flip to the section on the 30 Years' War, likely you will see something like this. The 30 Years' War divided up into 4 phases. And indeed, these 4 phases are sort of a nice way to break up the 30 Years' War. And as you can see, each of the 4 phases is identified by a country. So one way to think about the 30 Years' War was it was an international war. It was a European war. Almost all of the 30 Years' War is going to be fought within the Holy Roman Empire. And so it starts off as a war within the Holy Roman Empire, so a war of states against states in the Holy Roman Empire. But then it draws in these larger, more powerful countries like France, like Sweden, like Denmark. And poor Central Europe, the German-speaking states mostly, they become this playground of war for 30 years. And it is devastating to the people of the Holy Roman Empire. It might be a nice, easy fact to remember that during the 30 Years' War, 30% of the German peasants die within the course of these 30 years. And so when you look at the 4 phases, what you're looking at are the states that become the chief protagonists during particular times. So, and I will go over each of these in much greater detail throughout the course of the lecture, but to give us an overview right here, it starts off in the state of Bohemia, which is its own kingdom within the Holy Roman Empire. And there's a religious dispute that happens there. They start to do their own thing in defiance of the Holy Roman Emperor, and this conflict lasts 2 years. And so it starts off just this 2-year conflict, not a 30-year conflict, but just a 2-year conflict. But then the King of Denmark tried to get involved, and then the Holy Roman Empire fights Denmark. This particular fight, which lasts for 4 years, will have the ultimate result of the Holy Roman Empire once again becoming entirely Catholic. And so then Sweden gets involved, because the Swedes want to save the Protestants of the Holy Roman Empire. So the Swedish army will come down for the 3rd phase of the 30 Years' War. And then not long after the Swedes show up, the French get involved in this war, first by financing the Swedes and then getting involved with their armies directly. And when the French army shows up, then we have the 4th phase, the French phase. And that last phase, the French phase, it's the one that lasts the longest, over 10 years. Now, as I go over these 4 phases, it probably does nothing but confuse you, because I'm not really giving you that much context behind each of these, but I felt the need to start off the 30 Years' War by describing the 4 phases, since that's what you get with every textbook, every review book. And it might be helpful after you hear me tell the entire story of the 30 Years' War to go back and to look at these 4 phases, and you might nod your head and say, oh yeah, okay, that makes sense. And it's helpful to understand how the war evolved. But starting off right now, it probably just seems confusing. So let's learn the story. So we can understand the breakout of the 30 Years' War in this year 1618 as being the result of the principal weakness of the Peace of Augsburg. So let's take a moment and go back and revisit the Peace of Augsburg. In the beginning of the 1500s, we had the Reformation. It began in Saxony with Martin Luther. Some of the important princes and electors of the Holy Roman Empire, like Philip of Hesse and Frederick the Wise, they said we want to be Lutheran now. Their emperor, Charles V, said, no, you must all be Catholic. And the princes that wanted to be Lutheran, they unified themselves and created an alliance called the Schmalkaldic League. Charles V gets his imperial army and they fight battles, mostly in the 1540s and 1550s, that lead to, finally, what could be considered a Lutheran final victory. When 55-year-old Charles V says, I'm done fighting, and he issues the Peace of Augsburg to stop the fighting. The Peace of Augsburg, one of the most important documents you need to know about in AP European history, issued in the year 1555, when, of course, Charles V was 55 years old. And it is very important to know the contents of the Peace of Augsburg, which state this. Within the Holy Roman Empire, it is the prince that gets to choose the religion of his people. In other words, as they said back then, whose land, whose religion, or whose realm, whose religion. So if the prince or king of your region said, we are Catholic, then you are Catholic. If the prince or the king said, we are Lutheran, then you are Lutheran. And those were the only two options, Catholicism and Lutheranism. At the time, 1555, Calvinism was around, but it was a newborn religion. But remember, Calvinism becomes the fastest spreading Protestant religion of all time. So when we get to the 17th century, we're going to start dealing a lot with Calvinism. Okay, but back to 1555, let's remember what the principal weakness was of the Peace of Augsburg. And that weakness is this. What would happen if you had a prince or a king of a region who, according to the Peace of Augsburg, gets to determine the religion of his people, but the majority of the people disagree with that religion? This is, in short, what is going to cause the 30 Years' War. And if you remember, that first phase is in Bohemia, that's Czechia, or the Czech Republic today, and it will happen in the year 1618 that there will be a King of Bohemia who is himself not a Bohemian, but he's the King of Bohemia, and he's going to tell his people, you're Catholic. And the people of Bohemia are going to respond, no, we're not. And you're going to have a war. And that's what's going to cause the 30 Years' War. But there's a whole story that leads up to 1618 and the breakout of war. And I'm going to give you that background now. But the Peace of Augsburg, to reiterate, the weakness of the Peace of Augsburg, hopefully it makes sense to you, and it is a very important cause of the 30 Years' War. All right. So allow me to draw your attention to the western portion of the Holy Roman Empire, to a region called the Palatinate. Now today in Germany, this region is called the Rhineland-Pfalz area. It's a state in Germany, the Rhineland-Pfalz state in Germany. Back then, it was called the Palatinate. And today, it is right on the border of France. And back then, it was still culturally close to the French because it absorbed Calvinism. So much so that in the late 16th century, that's the late 1500s, the king of the Palatinate, who is also an elector in the Holy Roman Empire, himself becomes a Calvinist. This was a major move. It's a major decision. First of all, it's in clear violation of the Peace of Augsburg because the Peace of Augsburg said, no, you're either a Lutheran or you're Catholic. That's it. You cannot be a Calvinist. Calvinism, remember, is the radical religion. People thought about Calvinists back then, or at least Lutherans and Catholics, they thought about Calvinism back then as people think of like anarchists today. Calvinists seem to want to overthrow the entire social system. And now you have a king who says, my region of the Palatinate is going to be Calvinist. So yeah, he broke the law, but he's also the king. Who is going to stop him? So he gets away with it. And the Palatinate region in the Holy Roman Empire becomes Calvinist. Now, let me take a moment here to clarify something that is contradictory. If the Calvinists, if they believe in complete equality, essentially there's no king but King Jesus and every human being on earth is equal, then why would a king embrace this faith? So here's where it gets weird and contradictory. So just sort of use your imagination and work with me here. Calvinism was so popular with the peasants. So in some particular cases, like in the Palatinate and then also down in Navarre in southern France, you had situations where kings or princes decided it would be in their best interest to allow their people to embrace this new faith. And in all of these cases, or at least in Palatinate and in Navarre in the south of France, the royal family themselves saw the more Christian elements of Calvinism, and they embraced the faith themselves. But the royal family and the aristocrats of the land, they did not overthrow the social system. You don't have a king saying, hey, I'm going to renounce my throne and we're going to have a republic here. We're going to create like a Geneva. That never happened. So you have kings and aristocrats, you have royal families and you have aristocratic families that are Calvinist. That seems to be contradictory, and it is, but it was something that the majority of the people who lived in those regions at the time were willing to accept so that they could freely practice their faith and they weren't persecuted by Catholics or Lutherans or whoever else. Okay, so I hope that made sense. I may revisit that concept in future lectures. Okay, in the Palatinate region, there is a beautiful city, and it's still a beautiful city today. And so that king was King Frederick III of the Palatinate, and he helped to establish this city as a great university city in Europe, and that is the city of Heidelberg. Allow me to take a moment to celebrate our home state. There is a Heidelberg College here in Ohio. That, of course, has very close associations with Heidelberg University over in Germany. And the Heidelberg University was established as a great Catholic, I'm sorry, not a great Catholic, that's wrong, as a great Calvinist university. It had a fantastically large library filled with books that would have been illegal in most other places in Europe because they were these radical revolutionary texts, radical revolutionary Calvinist texts. So the Palatinate is Calvinist and the Palatinate is getting radical. Now, just to the south of the Palatinate, there is another very large and powerful, but not as powerful, German state within the Holy Roman Empire called Bavaria. Bavaria is very Catholic. It was back then, and it still is for the most part today, predominantly Catholic. And Catholics obviously don't like Lutherans, and they really don't like Calvinists because they see these Calvinists as these radical revolutionaries. And Bavaria doesn't like the fact that these radicals are right on their border. Now, the Bavarians have a king. His name is Maximilian the First of the Wittelsbach dynasty. And Maximilian the First is a little bit jealous of King Frederick III of the Palatinate because the king of the Palatinate is an elector of the Holy Roman Empire. Maximilian the First is not an elector, and he would like to become one because that is a very powerful position. So let's start here as a place where we can start to have the beginning rumblings of a potential war. Because if Maximilian the First of Bavaria can find an opportunity to go to war with the Palatinate, take over the Palatinate, absorb the Palatinate, or at least part of it, into Bavaria, then Maximilian the First can become an elector in the Holy Roman Empire. and Bavaria can become a much stronger state. And maybe even Maximilian might get a shot at becoming the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. So, to review just a little bit here, Palatinate, they're Calvinists, they're radical. Just south of them, we've got the Bavarians. They're Catholic. They see the Calvinists at the border as a threat. And the King of Bavaria could exploit this situation, take over the Palatinate, force them all to be Catholic. He gets a lot more land, becomes an elector, can possibly be seen as this incredible Catholic hero, and maybe even become the next emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. All right. Bavaria is a beautiful state in Germany. If you ever get a chance to visit it today, there's a lot to see there. There's a lot of great history there. It's right there in the Alps in Central Europe. I really do encourage you to visit the city of Munich if you ever have a chance. There is a central cathedral in downtown Munich, which is exemplary of the Baroque art movement in terms of Baroque architecture, and is clearly a product of the Counter-Reformation, the Bavarians showing off that they were not Protestant. So their cathedral is huge, beautiful, gaudy, filled with intricate, elaborate artwork so that when you walk into it, you are awed before the power of God, which is exactly how a cathedral is supposed to make you feel. So now, when war finally comes, it's this man who will be leading the Bavarian forces for the Holy Roman Empire against the Protestants. And all I want to do right now is just introduce you to him. His name is Count Tilly, and he is the commander of the Bavarian forces. Okay, so I hope this all makes sense. I hope you have a good sort of groundwork for what's going on in the Holy Roman Empire as we go into the early 17th century. And as we go into a new century, the 1600s, we now need to visit this city, Prague. Prague is, of course, the capital city of the Kingdom of Bohemia, which is a state within the Holy Roman Empire. Now, Bohemia is a kingdom, which means they have their own king. But the poor Bohemians, they haven't had a Bohemian king in quite some time. Really, not since the Middle Ages, because they'd had other kings who were Hungarian, and throughout the entirety of the 1500s, their kings were also the Habsburg emperors of the Holy Roman Empire. So the King of Bohemia is the same individual as the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. Now you remember all of the emperors of the Holy Roman Empire that we need to know about are Habsburgs. And the Habsburgs' hometown is Vienna, Austria. They are ethnically Germanic. And being ethnically Germanic, being Austrian, they consider themselves to be ethnically very different from the Slavic people of Bohemia. So typically, the Habsburg emperors don't really care that much about their kingdom of Bohemia. They don't spend a lot of time in Prague. They simply just don't like it, even though, technically, they are the king of Bohemia. Now, on the Bohemian side of things, the poor Bohemian people, they tried to do their own thing in the early 15th century during the days of Jan Hus. They tried to reform their own church. Jan Hus, of course, burnt at the stake at the Council of Constance. That led to a series of Hussite wars, and the Holy Roman Empire crushed the Bohemian rebels. And now the Holy Roman Emperor is also the King of Bohemia, even though he typically doesn't like the Bohemians. So suffice it to say that the Bohemian people feel like an oppressed people, and they naturally become very protective of their culture. And part of their culture is a little bit of political radicalism. They remember Jan Hus. And just to let you guys know, throughout the duration of this course, it seems like the people of Prague in particular are always just a little bit more radical than the rest of Europe. This actually becomes a topic in some of my last lectures on the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe. There are some incredibly interesting and radical people that come out of Prague during that story. But now I'm getting way ahead of myself. Okay, so let me take it back to the beginning of the 1600s. Hopefully you understand what's going on culturally with Bohemia, and hopefully you understand the political setup. Okay, Holy Roman Empire, emperors, Habsburgs, they don't like the people of Bohemia, and yet they're the kings of Bohemia. And then this guy comes along. Here is one of the most interesting people that I can talk about in AP Euro. And boy, there are a lot of interesting people we talk about in AP Euro, but this guy ranks high in terms of his eccentricity, in terms of his weirdness. And he was the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. His name was Rudolph the Second. Rudolph the Second never married, but he had a mistress and several illegitimate children. Rudolph II, if he was around today, most likely would be diagnosed with depression or bipolar disorder. Rudolph II, a genuine lover of animals. So if you remember Prague Castle is by square footage the biggest castle in the entire world. I think I mentioned it before that if you visited Prague Castle today and you wanted to visit every single room in that castle, it would take you approximately 5 days. He had Prague Castle stocked with exotic animals, giraffes, monkeys, bears. It was a menagerie. Now, I'm starting to hone in on what makes Rudolph II exceptional as a Habsburg emperor. He fell in love with the city of Prague, and he moved his court from Vienna, Austria, to Prague. He loved the city, he loved the people. This made Rudolph II extraordinarily unique in terms of a Habsburg. Maybe he's just one of these guys that just wants to do things differently than from everybody else in his family. I mean, you might feel this way. Hey, just because, mom and dad and grandparents, they have their values and their way of living, I'm going to do the exact opposite. And maybe that's one of the reasons why he liked Prague. But another reason why he loved Prague was because he felt that the people there were more eccentric and exciting. Rudolph II, and this is another very important part or aspect of Rudolph II. Rudolph II was obsessed with the occult. Now, when I say the occult, what I'm talking about are the forbidden sciences of the early 1600s. People who sometimes get identified as witches and warlocks, who do things like practice alchemy. Alchemists were people who tried to create gold. They wanted to see if you could put particular metals together, heat them up, melt them down, combine them, and create gold. Now, if you know your basic science, you know that this is absolutely impossible to do, that gold is itself a fundamental element in the universe. You can't put things together to make gold. But they didn't know that back then, and they're experimenting. And witches trying to create secret potions. Potions to make people fall in love, potions to make people get ill, potions to heal the sick, medicinal potions. And there are other occultists, people called astrologers, who believe that the movement of the earth and the moon and the stars and the planets somehow influence the processes of things on earth. Rudolph II was interested in all of this. And while he held court in Prague, he openly supported these things. Witches, warlocks, alchemists, astrologers. Come one, come all. Prague is a safe city for you. You might be persecuted by every other religion in Europe. Catholics will kill you. Calvinists will kill you. Lutherans will kill you. But in Prague, you're safe because the emperor himself is interested in what you are doing. So when Rudolph II invites all these different types to come to Prague to practice whatever it is they want to practice, you can imagine the culture that was established in Prague during the late 16th and early 17th centuries. And the impact of this culture can't be underestimated because understand who these people were. I mean, if you have alchemists coming to Prague trying to figure out how to make gold, well, they may not actually make gold, but you know what they're doing? They're laying the foundations for chemistry in the future. These so-called witches with their herbal remedies, well, they're laying the foundations for future medicine, pharmacology. Astrologers are, to a certain extent, also astronomers. We've got some great mathematics and science that are also happening in Prague at this time. So all of these weird occult things that are happening in Prague are actually laying the foundations for the future of the scientific revolution. Individuals that we'll learn about in the future, like Tycho Brahe and Johannes Kepler, spent time in Prague during the reign of Rudolph the Second. Okay, so hopefully you can understand why Rudolph the Second is really a very exciting figure to study in European history. And within recent years, I've personally come across several podcasts about Rudolph the Second in particular. So if you're interested in learning more about this man, there's a lot out there. Feel free to look him up. And here is a portrait of Rudolph II. It is probably one of the most unique portraits in all of world history. If you have a moment to look at your screen, hey, check this out. This is the work of the Italian Baroque artist Giuseppe Arcimboldo. The title of it is Verdumnus. Verdumnus was the Roman god of seasons and change. And it is also a portrait of Rudolph II. I have no words to describe this particular portrait. Any attempt I make to describe this portrait will be futile and stupid. But the artistry and talent of Arcimboldo should reveal itself very clearly. This portrait is, for me, quite amazing, and you could probably get lost in looking at it for quite some time. And if you would like to pause this lecture and do that, why, I encourage that. I do think that the unique aspect of this portrait reflects the very unique, creative, eccentric culture that Rudolph II established in Prague in the late 1500s and early 1600s. Okay, but there is one last thing I need to talk about with Rudolph II. At the end of his reign in the early 17th century, Rudolph II was having trouble with his family. The other Habsburgs didn't like him that much. He was too eccentric, he was too strange, he might have been mentally unstable. They didn't like that he had moved his court to Prague. They didn't like what was going on in Prague. And so his own brother was actually rallying forces against him. So Rudolph II found himself having to raise an army in Bohemia to defend Bohemia from his own family. It was Rudolph II's younger brother who had actually taken control of the imperial army and was trying to invade Bohemia and overthrow Rudolph. So when you get to the year 1609, Rudolph II was in a very perilous position. Politically, he was very weak. His own family was trying to remove him and replace him with his more conservative, more traditional younger brother. And it was at this moment of political weakness for Rudolph II when Protestants in Prague came to speak to Rudolph II. Now, Rudolph II needs the support of his people more than ever at this point in time. He needs the support of the Bohemians more than ever at this point in time. And the Bohemians themselves, they have had a tradition of radicalism going all the way back to Jan Hus. They specifically have wanted freedom of religion in some form going all the way back to Jan Hus. So in 1609, Protestants approached Rudolph II, pledging to Rudolph II the support of the Bohemian people if he would legitimize freedom of religion in law. Now, it seems to me that this had been going on in practice, this freedom of religion had been going on in practice for quite some time since Rudolph II had been the King of Bohemia as well as the Holy Roman Emperor. But now we're going to have an actual law. And this law is part of a deal that the people of Bohemia, especially the Protestants in Bohemia, would support Rudolph II in return for him providing them with freedom of religion. And so the deal is struck, and Rudolph II issues what we call the Letter of Majesty, issued in 1609. The Letter of Majesty is one of the most radical documents in European history. The Letter of Majesty of 1609 provided to the people of Bohemia complete freedom of religion. Every individual was allowed to worship however he or she chose to worship. Complete freedom of religion. This is just like the United States of America today. It's complete freedom of religion. This is much more radical than in France, the Edict of Nantes, which provided freedom of religion for communities. It's much more radical than the Peace of Augsburg, which said the prince gets to determine the religion of his realm. This puts it in the hands of individuals. You worship however it is you want to worship. It is one of the most radical documents in the history of religious tolerance. And it is issued, once again, in the year 1609. Not but 3 years later, Rudolph the Second is dead. And so now when Rudolph the Second dies, what's to happen to Bohemia? What's to happen to Prague? Is this culture going to continue? Is the Letter of Majesty going to be honored? Well, for a brief period of time, Rudolph II's younger brother, Matthias, he became the King of Bohemia and he ruled over them. And he actually did honor the Letter of Majesty for a period of time. And he probably did that, not because he believed in it, but he just sort of wanted to keep the peace with the people. But he didn't last that long. In 1617, we've got a new King of Bohemia and future Holy Roman Emperor. He is the Habsburg ruler Ferdinand II. And Ferdinand II will make a crucial decision that will cause the 30 Years' War. Ferdinand II, educated by Jesuits, a devout Catholic, he feels the need to set Bohemia straight, make them all Catholic again. So Ferdinand II sent 4 Catholic officials into Prague. Their goal was to work with, and really force, the political leadership of Prague to overturn the Letter of Majesty and to force everybody in Bohemia to be Catholic. When these 4 men arrived in Prague, they met with city officials in Prague Castle. Some heated words were exchanged, and then 2 of these Catholic officials were grabbed and they were thrown out of a window, along with a secretary who was working for one of those Catholic officials, and he was chucked out of the window too. This is that event captured here. 3 men getting tossed out of a relatively high window. They're about 4 to 5 stories off the ground. This event, which is the start of the 30 Years' War, this event is called the Defenestration of Prague. Now, there's a fun word to learn. Defenestrate. Defenestrate is a fun word to learn here in AP Euro. Every AP Euro student learns it. To defenestrate means to throw out of a window. Defenestrate. Hey, if you speak just a little German, the German word for window is Fenster. If you speak a little French, the French word for window is fenêtre. So hopefully you might be able to see those words in this word, defenestrate. Okay, so in 2014, I got to visit Prague, and I get to go to Prague Castle, and we were standing in a room, and our tour guide said, so this is where the defenestration happened. And she pointed at the windows, and I was standing right next to the windows, so it was actually a cramped little room. It's a lot smaller than most of the pictures portray it. But I got out my phone and I started taking pictures, and this is the picture I got of the 2 windows that 3 men were chucked out of. And it seems like you'd have to really push them through to get them out. It's not like they're big open windows. But then I boldly took my phone and held it out the window, and holding my phone out the window, I took a picture, and here is that picture. So you get a sense of the fall that these guys took. And take a look, and you can see the people there on the ground, so you get a sense of how high up you are. The 2 guys that fell, one of them really hurt his head, and you can see that ledge where a guy would have, smacked his head on his way down. All of the men survived the fall, and they weren't even injured. And there's 2 stories for how the men survived the fall. One is the Catholic story, which is that angels swooped down to cradle them and make sure that they didn't get hurt on the fall down. The other, probably more realistic story, is that there was a bunch of horse manure shoveled up against the side of Prague Castle. Remember, this is a day and age before cars. There were a lot of horses on the streets. Horses poo. The manure is shoveled against the side of buildings. So there was a pile of horse manure, which would have been quite common, and that the men hit the pile of manure, and that's what enabled them to survive. And then what happened to them after that, I have no idea. Who cares? But what I do care about is what happens to Bohemia after this. Bohemia has just essentially had a revolution. They've thrown Catholic officials sent by the Emperor Ferdinand II out of a window. They're taking over. But then they decide, okay, we're going to rule here. But what we need to be legitimate is to have a king. We need a new king of Bohemia. So the city officials in Prague reached out to the Palatinate, that radical area that I talked about in the earlier part of the lecture that had become Calvinist. They reached out to the descendant of King Frederick III, King Frederick V, and they invited him to be the King of Bohemia along with the King of the Palatinate. For the Bohemians, this was a safe bet because this guy is extraordinarily powerful. He is an elector. He is as high up as you can get in terms of political power in the Holy Roman Emperor, aside from being an emperor himself. So on the Bohemian side, they're like, this guy's a radical, he's a Calvinist, he'll respect the letter of majesty, and we invite him to be king. Of course, for Frederick V, this is a pretty sweet deal because he essentially gets to double the size of his lands, and so he accepts. And he leaves the Palatinate to go to Prague to establish court. And when he does this, it essentially starts a civil war in the Holy Roman Empire. The Habsburgs want to they want to take control of Bohemia. The Habsburgs, specifically Ferdinand II, he wants to be king of Bohemia. The Habsburgs want Frederick V out of Bohemia and back to the Palatinate. So as Ferdinand II is preparing an army to go invade Bohemia and to drive out Frederick V and take control of Bohemia and the city of Prague, he gets a very willing accomplice. Maximilian the First, the King of Bavaria, staunch Catholic. They're just south of the Palatinate. They don't like the Palatinate. Maximilian the First is not an elector. He would love to be an elector. And he can become an elector if he takes over the Palatinate. So Maximilian the First of Bavaria says to Ferdinand II, whoa, how about if I help out with this? Let's raise a Bavarian army to go into Bohemia. I've got my man Count Tilly. He'll drive into Bohemia. We will capture the city of Prague and deliver it to you. And then, because I've conquered the king of the Palatinate, who's also the king of Bohemia, I, Maximilian I, also get to take over the Palatinate, thus making me an elector in the Holy Roman Empire. So, in other words, this whole situation, Maximilian I sees as an opportunity for himself to defend Catholicism and to spread Catholicism and also to make himself extraordinarily powerful. All right, so hopefully this setup makes sense. Ferdinand II and Maximilian I agree to go into Bohemia together. They do. Notice that Bohemia and Bavaria are right next to each other. So, into Bohemia comes a Bavarian army led by Count Tilly. It is supported by the imperial army of Ferdinand II. Bohemia is defended by the Bohemian forces. Frederick V, I do not believe was there. When we have our epic Battle of White Mountain in 1620, in which the Bohemians lose. They lose bad. The Bavarian and imperial armies win. They take over Prague. Frederick V runs away to the Netherlands, which is also very Calvinist. Prague and all of Bohemia is forced to be Catholic again. The letter of majesty is overturned, obviously, and Maximilian I of Bavaria takes over the Palatinate. If you go to Heidelberg, Germany today, you are no longer in Palatinate, or what they call the Rhineland-Pfalz area today. You are in Bavaria, the northern part of Bavaria, but still Bavaria. The radical Calvinists living in the Palatinate, if they wanted to survive, they had to flee too. Either that or they had to quickly convert to Catholicism because Maximilian the First and the Bavarians are taking over the Palatinate. And this means that Maximilian the First can become one of the most powerful men in the Holy Roman Empire. He becomes an elector. So now's when I'm going to interject and give you some random history here. Maximilian the First was part of the Wittelsbach dynasty, and for what it's worth, the Wittelsbach dynasty is still around today. One of the main reasons why they're still around today is because they openly opposed the rise of Hitler in the 1920s and the 1930s in Germany. And so after World War II, a lot of people liked the Wittelsbach dynasty because of that. And so they're still around today. So here's the Duke of Bavaria. Here's the successor of Maximilian the First. There he is. And for what it's worth, he's still a bachelor. So if you want to be royalty, maybe you can marry him. All right, so that's it for the Wittelsbach dynasty. Please pardon my random historical facts. Okay, so the 30 Years' War should not have been a 30 Years' War. It should have been a 2 Years' War. It should have been, the War of Bohemian Insurrection or something like that. So what happens? How did one battle and a small war lead to one of the most catastrophic events in European history? Well, it had to do with the country north of the Holy Roman Empire, Denmark. This was completely unrelated to anything in Prague, Bohemia, or Palatinate, or Bavaria. Denmark has nothing to do with any of that stuff, but the King of Denmark did do something to upset the Holy Roman Emperor, Ferdinand II. So let's take it up to Denmark. If you can find Denmark on the map here, you can see that Denmark is a little peninsula that sticks up off of Central Europe. Denmark is part of the Scandinavian world, and Denmark and Sweden were actually one country. Denmark and Sweden had recently split off, and there are all these islands in the Baltic Sea in between Denmark and Sweden claimed most of them for itself. So Denmark felt like they had been ripped off by Sweden, and Denmark wants a little bit more land. And so the King of Denmark at the time, a man who we'll talk about in a couple of different contexts, both during the 30 Years' War, we'll also talk about him again briefly when we talk about the Scientific Revolution. The King of Denmark at the time was a man named Christian IV. Christian IV and all of the Danes, they are Lutheran, just like most of the states in the northern part of the Holy Roman Empire, as well as Sweden. They're all Lutheran. All right, but this is really about land. Denmark feels like it's been ripped off in terms of its possessions. Now, if you look at the map, just south of Denmark, there is an area that is part of the Holy Roman Empire, and it's called Holstein. And there were a few ports along the coast of Holstein where the King of Denmark felt that the Danes had enough influence that those cities, those coastal cities, could be rightfully claimed for Denmark. And so Denmark seized areas in Holstein. In other words, to just simplify this very much, Denmark is taking over some cities in the northern part of the Holy Roman Empire. They're taking land from the Holy Roman Empire. Okay, so word of this travels down south to Vienna, and Ferdinand II finds out about it. And Ferdinand II gets all angry, and he wants to send an army up there to reclaim those lands, put Christian IV and the Danes back in their place. Now, all this started happening in the year 1625. So this is 5 years after the Battle of White Mountain. It's 7 years after the Defenestration of Prague. All right, so this was a pretty bold move on the part of Christian IV. I mean, stealing land from another country, it tends not to go over too well. He was probably thinking that, and I'll admit I'm sort of guessing here, he was probably thinking that there's enough Danish culture here, there are enough Danish people here, we can claim these as our lands. And what does Ferdinand II care? Like, is he really going to send an army all the way up here to take back these coastal cities? Well, Ferdinand II was really angry, and he thought, we're going to get these lands back. Now, Maximilian the First and Count Tilly and the Bavarians, they're ready to go. Please let us go up there and invade. We'll whip the Danes. We'll take back those coastal cities and give them right back to you, Ferdinand II. But Ferdinand II is a little concerned about Maximilian the First. He's already become an elector. He's already sort of the hero of the day after the Battle of White Mountain. Ferdinand II starts to feel jealous. He starts to feel that the Wittelsbach dynasty, Maximilian the First family, if they keep winning battles, they might become more powerful than him, and the Wittelsbach dynasty, they might start becoming the emperors, and it will be the end of the Habsburgs. What we will find is that Ferdinand II does get jealous. He's always very concerned that somebody else is going to become emperor and he's going to lose power. So because of that, Ferdinand II says, no, the Bavarian military under Count Tilly is not going to be the primary force going up to fight the Danes. And Ferdinand II looks for a new military commander to lead an imperial army from the south all the way up to the north to recapture these coastal cities. And the man that Ferdinand II chooses for the job was another extraordinarily eccentric figure. He also can be considered one of the cruelest people in all of European history. And that is, of course, saying something. There are a lot of cruel people that we talk about. This man's name was Albrecht von Wallenstein. He's an interesting guy. He was actually a Bohemian, but he became a staunch Catholic. Well, or at least, let me say it like this. He became a Catholic to appease Ferdinand II. By no account was Albrecht von Wallenstein a good practicing Christian of any sort. But he was a Catholic, technically a Catholic, so that Ferdinand II would support him. And Albrecht von Wallenstein volunteered to lead an army of what would grow to be some 80,000 men, and that he would lead them from Bohemia all the way up to Denmark, and he would recapture those towns. Now, just to put this on the map, here is the invasion of Denmark that's going to commence in the year 1625. You've got Count Tilly, who's going to be coming up from Bavaria, and then you're going to have the imperial army led by Albrecht von Wallenstein. Now, Ferdinand II likes Wallenstein because he's not Bavarian. He's not working for the Wittelsbach dynasty. He's not working for Maximilian the First. And Wallenstein tells Ferdinand II, I'm going to make this as cost efficient for you as possible. Ferdinand II says, all right, Wallenstein, talk to me. Wallenstein says to Ferdinand II, what I need is military equipment. You have to provide us with military equipment. So I need the guns, I need the swords, I need the shields, I need the horses, I need the cannon, I need the military equipment. But that's all you need to provide for me. When it comes to soldiers' pay and food, I'll take care of that. Ferdinand II says, all right, this is beautiful. That saves me a lot of money. But now what you as a student need to think about is, how is Wallenstein II going to take care of his military force? How would you take care of a military force of some 80,000 men as they march several hundred miles to engage in battle? So here's where I need for you to look at the map. Find Bohemia and where Wallenstein is leading his men from and toward. And you can tell when you leave Bohemia, which on this map is green for Catholic, because that's what happened to Bohemia after the year 1620. And then it goes through all these lands, which are part of the Holy Roman Empire, but they're yellow, which means they're Lutheran. Wallenstein is going to lead these 80,000 men from town to town to town through the northern part of the Holy Roman Empire, which are mostly Lutheran. And when he gets to each town, when he gets to each village, he just lets the soldiers loose. You want food? Go get it. This is what makes Wallenstein a monster. They didn't have the term crimes against humanity at this point in time in history, but that is exactly what happened. Unpaid, unfed soldiers were let loose onto villages. And these, like most soldiers throughout history, are young men, boys in their teens and young guys in their 20s. And they know their only food and pay is going to come from stealing. So these 80,000 young men pillage and rape their way throughout the entire northern part of the Holy Roman Empire. Scenes as depicted here in this particular image were frequent occurrences throughout the 30 Years' War. It is why, during the course of the 30 Years' War, 1/3 of the German population will be killed. There are these tragic stories of butchery, stories of farm homes being attacked by Wallenstein's army, and the guys would come in. And if they were merciful, they'd probably just kill you. But such a culture had developed among these men that it became routine to torture. One of the ways in which they tortured men that they came across was to capture them and to squish them into ovens and then to turn the oven on and cook men alive. Women were vulnerable in the obvious way. If Wallenstein's army was coming, you would want to run. As a young man, one of the ways you could potentially save yourself is to join Wallenstein's army. But Wallenstein's army just became an army of brutality. And I think about this a lot when it comes to warfare and soldiers and warfare, because this happens repeatedly. It doesn't matter when in time you are. Ordinarily good men in civilian life turn into monsters. And that happens when you have a situation like this where there is no penalty for doing brutal things. And in fact, you're even rewarded. I mean, if I was in Wallenstein's army, if I was a soldier, say I'm a 20-year-old young man in Wallenstein's army, I want to eat. Well, how am I going to eat? If we're all going into this village, who's going to get the food? And then if I am one of the first into a farmhouse and I'm ransacking the place trying to get food, if there's no punishment for me to hurt somebody, to torture somebody, and in fact, that type of behavior is encouraged and applauded, odds are I'm going to engage in that brutal behavior. The history of warfare tells us that this is what will happen. Even among the best people in society, you put them in these awful situations, the worst of them will emerge. And that is certainly what happened during the 30 Years' War. So, we had Wallenstein and Tilly rampaging their way from the southern part of the Holy Roman Empire to the northern part of the Holy Roman Empire. They fight and defeat the Danes. Christian IV and his military, they retreat. Wallenstein and Tilly did not take over Copenhagen, which is the capital of Denmark. And Christian IV would continue to be able to rule. But look at this map. Look at what Wallenstein and Tilly, look at where they've been. Look at what they've essentially conquered. The entirety of the northern part of the Holy Roman Empire. And they've delivered this into the hands of Ferdinand II. All of these lands, which are actually technically yours, but since the 1555 Peace of Augsburg, the Habsburgs have allowed for the princes to choose the religion. Well, now things are a little bit different since the imperial army has swooped up and taken over all these lands. Ferdinand II can now control the whole thing. And so he issues in the year 1629 something called the Edict of Restitution. The Edict of Restitution in 1629 makes the entirety of the Holy Roman Empire Catholic. In other words, the Peace of Augsburg is revoked. Everybody must now be Catholic. And I can only imagine at this period of time, Ferdinand II feeling like, wow, I did it. I did what Charles V couldn't do. I restored Catholicism to the entirety of the Holy Roman Empire. Albrecht of Wallenstein's a monster, but he does win battles, and he effectively conquered the Lutheran areas of the Holy Roman Empire. So now, all of the Holy Roman Empire is Catholic, technically. But the year is 1629. We're over 100 years past Martin Luther. The people who have survived this rampage in the northern lands of the Holy Roman Empire, places like Saxony, they're Lutheran. They have 100 years of cultural traditions, of being Lutheran. Just because the emperor makes this law that says you are now all Catholic and I've got a military force to support that decree, the people in their hearts aren't going to support it. And as this slide says, there simply weren't enough priests to conduct Catholic services throughout the Holy Roman Empire. But 1629 and the Edict of Restitution was a sad time for all Protestants in the Holy Roman Empire. And now they're looking for a savior, somebody to come into the Holy Roman Empire to free them from this Catholic tyranny of Ferdinand the Second. And a savior did arrive in the form of the King of Sweden, King Gustavus Adolphus, known as the Lion of the North. Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden was a devout Lutheran. He was the opposite of Albrecht von Wallenstein. He really seemed to care for people. And Gustavus Adolphus, as we will see, is considered to be one of the greatest military commanders of all time, mostly due to his innovative use of heavy artillery. So it was the year 1630, which Gustavus Adolphus felt was very symbolic because it was exactly 100 years after the Augsburg Confession of 1530. That's when, if you remember, the electors, several of them kneeled down before Charles V and pledged their lives to being Lutheran. And so the centennial of that event, Gustavus Adolphus felt was perfect for the army of Sweden to go into those lands that had pledged to be Lutheran and save Protestantism in those areas. So thus begins the third phase of the 30 Years' War, and the Swedes invade. Now, as I said before, Gustavus Adolphus is considered to be one of the greatest military commanders of all time, and he's very similar to Napoleon in this way. What made Gustavus Adolphus great was his use of cannon. So Gustavus Adolphus, instead of using big, heavy cannon that could fire cannonballs long distance, he opted instead for lighter weight cannon that could be strapped to the back of a horse, and several of these cannon could be moved quickly to surround an enemy army, to fire upon them, and to blast them away. This was a very innovative thing to do at the time. And in the first major battle between Gustavus Adolphus and Albrecht von Wallenstein in 1631, the Battle of Breitenfeld, the Swedish army devastated the imperial army. Gustavus Adolphus had about 23,000 men in his army versus Wallenstein's near 80,000. And 23,000 Swedes killed 27,000 imperial soldiers. Wallenstein is on the run, and Sweden is now creating an empire on the continent of Europe. Now, today we certainly don't think of Sweden as an imperial country, but in the early 17th century, they really, really were. They had a very powerful presence, powerful military presence on the European continent. And this will last into the 1700s, and it will ultimately be Tsar Peter the Great of Russia, who will do a lot to drive the Swedes back into Sweden. But in the early 1600s, we're about 75 years away from all that, in the early 1600s and the 1630s, Sweden is a very powerful presence on the continent. They're creating an empire. They're taking over the northern part of the Holy Roman Empire, and they're bringing back Lutheranism to the people there. They are reinstating the Lutheran aristocratic and royal families that own land there, but they're now part of the Swedish Empire. Now, I said that Gustavus Adolphus is remembered for being the nice guy, sort of the opposite of Albrecht von Wallenstein. He is doing a much better job at providing for his soldiers. When they go from town to town to town, they are mostly paying for their food. How is Sweden able to finance that? And here's where things get really complicated in terms of religion. Now, remember that Gustavus Adolphus is doing all this because he wants to be the savior for the Lutherans in the northern part of the Holy Roman Empire. He could have just stayed in Sweden. I mean, Sweden was not under attack in any way, shape, or form. He could have stayed in Sweden and the Swedes could have minded their own business and they would have been just fine. But they didn't. They wanted to save the Lutherans in the northern part of the Holy Roman Empire. The weird part of all this is they're getting their money from one of the most powerful Catholic countries in Europe, France. Specifically, the head of state of France at the time, is Cardinal Richelieu. Louis XIII is the King of France. He's the son of Henry IV, but Louis XIII doesn't really want to rule. He just wants to have a good time. So Cardinal Richelieu, the highest ranking member of the Catholic Church in France, an advisor to Louis XIII, he's running the show. And he's giving money to the Swedes. Why would Richelieu do this? Why would Richelieu, a cardinal in the Catholic Church, why would he be financing Gustavus Adolphus and the Lutheran Swedes? Well, the answer here isn't religious, it's political. The French, I hope you remember, do not like the Habsburgs. The French have always felt surrounded by the Habsburgs. They're over there east in the Holy Roman Empire. They're down south in Spain. They are completely surrounding us. There has always been this antagonism between the French and the Habsburgs. So when Cardinal Richelieu sees Gustavus Adolphus driving into the Holy Roman Empire, taking a whole bunch of land away from the Habsburgs, destroying the military of the Habsburgs, Richelieu thinks, this is great, keep it up, Sweden. We don't care what religion you are. Because if the Swedes keep this up and the imperial army gets so decimated, well then now the French can start invading from the west. And the French can start taking lands away from the Holy Roman Empire. So Richelieu says to Sweden, here's a whole bunch of money. Do your best. And that's exactly what Sweden does for 2 years until the Battle of Lutzen in November of 1632, when Gustavus Adolphus, being the heroic king that he was, led men into battle, disappeared into a cloud of smoke. And when the smoke finally cleared and Gustavus Adolphus was found, he had been mortally wounded. He dies, and his body is sent back to Stockholm. And his 6-year-old daughter becomes the next queen of Sweden, the next ruler of Sweden. And she actually will play an important role in the scientific revolution that we'll learn about later. So this is obviously a major blow for the Swedes. Their king is dead. He was a great military commander. Now will the other military commanders be able to maintain what Gustavus Adolphus has won, especially now since they have to face off against Albrecht von Wallenstein? Well, it's after Gustavus Adolphus dies that the Swedes begin losing and losing and losing against Albrecht von Wallenstein. And Wallenstein is himself conquering the Holy Roman Empire. And Wallenstein, being Wallenstein, begins thinking, you know what? I've conquered all this. I could be like Julius Caesar and just proclaim myself emperor and I could rule all of this. And Ferdinand II knows this. Ferdinand II knows that Wallenstein might try to proclaim himself emperor. So Ferdinand II hired some good Irish Catholic mercenaries to join Wallenstein's army and to assassinate Albrecht von Wallenstein. Wallenstein was killed in the year 1634. The Holy Roman Empire is a mess, and here comes France. The fourth phase and the final phase of the 30 Years' War begins after the death of Albrecht von Wallenstein and the French invade. And we have nearly 15 years of relentless fighting. The Imperial Army, the Swedes, the French, mercenaries from the British Isles. The Dutch end up getting involved because Spain tries to start taking over the Netherlands again. The German-speaking states of Central Europe became an international playground of war. It was brutal. And the war really only comes to a conclusion out of sheer exhaustion. After so much fighting for so long, with nobody really able to see what a victory is going to be in all this, we finally have a diplomatic moment in the year 1648. Representatives from nearly every state on the continent of Europe met in the northern German town of Westphalia to come up with a peace treaty to end this catastrophe. And the result is, of course, the Peace of Westphalia of 1648. This is an extraordinarily important document to know. It's also worth noting that the year 1648 is a pivotal turning point year in European history, and specifically in our study of AP European history. 1648 usually marks the end of the first quarter of this course. Okay, so let's learn about this very important document. So the first part of the Peace of Westphalia is strikingly similar to the Peace of Augsburg. It says that within the Holy Roman Empire, princes get to choose the religion of their realm. They get to choose between 3 religions now, not just 2: Catholicism, Lutheranism, or Calvinism. So this is the exact same thing as the Peace of Augsburg, except that we get to add Calvinism into the mix. So this makes the whole 30 Years' War seem rather trivial and awful and even more catastrophic. All that death, all that destruction, a whole generation of fighting, and all that comes out of it is one religion gets legitimized. Seems rather silly, and it probably is. Silly in an awful way. Okay, also out of the Peace of Westphalia, 2 states are acknowledged as being independent countries. Within the Holy Roman Empire, Switzerland is now its own country. Also, the United Provinces, or the Netherlands are acknowledged as being an independent country. Now, for the most part, the Netherlands were operating as an independent country. They had been for a while. They had fought their wars of independence mostly in the 1660s through the 1690s. There was, hopefully you remember, William of Orange, otherwise known as William the Silent, who was assassinated in the 1580s. The Dutch had fought their independence against for their independence against Spain. They were mostly operating independently, but the Peace of Westphalia formally acknowledges that the Dutch are free. The Netherlands is its own country. So those are the big elements of what the Peace of Westphalia entailed. You need to know these things. But you also need to know what the Peace of Westphalia represented within the larger context of European history. Okay, so let's first talk about the Habsburg family. So the Habsburg family, they are the Holy Roman Emperors, right? We've been studying them since Charles V, and really even before that with his grandpa, Maximilian. But when we think of the Habsburgs up until this point in time, we think of them as being the Holy Roman Emperors. They are also devout Catholics, and they wish that everybody in the Holy Roman Empire was Catholic, but they started giving up on that with the Peace of Augsburg in 1555. Okay, you can think of the 30 Years' War as the Habsburgs once again trying to make all of their empire Catholic, and they fail. They fail, right? The Peace of Westphalia is nothing but the Peace of Augsburg Part 2. This dream of having the entirety of the Holy Roman Empire led by the Habsburgs and everybody being Catholic, that is now gone. Too much death, too much destruction, it's gone. So the Habsburgs then have a change of attitude that will influence the rest of European history. The Habsburgs, they just decide to dust their hands clean of the entirety of the Holy Roman Empire, except for their homeland, Austria. I mean, their attitude towards the rest of the Holy Roman Empire is, whatever. Saxons, you want to be Protestant, knock yourself out. Bavarians, hey, you're close by Catholics, but whatever, you do your own thing. We're Austria. We're going to focus on Austria. And the Habsburgs, then, in focusing on Austria, begin to see the future of their empire as spreading eastward. So Austria is still always technically a state in the Holy Roman Empire, so long as the Holy Roman Empire exists. But Austria will create its own new empire because it will begin spreading eastward. So east of Austria is the Ottoman Empire, and the Ottoman Turks are the old foes of the Habsburgs. And what starts to happen with the Ottoman Empire once you get to the end of the 17th century is they start going into decline. This has to do with mostly financial mismanagement of the empire, but it gives Austria an opportunity to begin conquering lands east of it. So it'll go into lands like Hungary or modern-day Slovakia, Romania, Croatia. And Austria begins spreading east as the Ottoman Empire slowly collapses into Asia Minor and the easternmost area of the Balkans. So, in short, Habsburgs give up on the Holy Roman Empire, but they begin developing the state of Austria and creating an Austrian Empire that spreads eastward. And if I can make a big historical connection here, that eastward spread of the Austrian Empire, taking over lands that once belonged to the Ottomans, will eventually lead to the cause of the First World War in the year 1914, nearly 300 years after the Peace of Westphalia. So that was a major consequence of the 30 Years' War and the Peace of Westphalia. Okay, another element of the Peace of Westphalia and the new Europe that it created. Those German-speaking states in Central Europe, they are weak and politically divided, but one of them, as a result of the 30 Years' War, will begin the process of strengthening itself to eventually become, by the 19th century, and actually, the 18th century really, one of the most powerful countries in Europe, and that is the state of Brandenburg, Prussia. Brandenburg, Prussia, which are actually two states within the Holy Roman Empire that fused, they combined as a result of the 30 Years' War. This was a state that realized just how vulnerable it was during the 30 Years' War. Brandenburg, Prussia has no natural boundaries. They don't have any big mountain ranges or major rivers or other bodies of water that it can use to defend itself. Brandenburg, Prussia is pretty much flat farmland, and it doesn't have any good natural barriers to serve as its boundaries. So after the 30 Years' War, Brandenburg, Prussia decides we never, ever, ever want to have something like the 30 Years' War happen to us again, where you have the Swedes invading from the north and the Imperial Army from the south and all these other armies coming in, doing brutal things to the people that live here. So go figure, Brandenburg, Prussia decides to begin developing a powerful military. If Brandenburg, Prussia doesn't have natural barriers to defend itself, it will create its own barrier of a powerful military force. So that by the time we get to the 18th century and Brandenburg, Prussia is just simply called Prussia, it will be said that Prussia is not a country that has an army, but rather Prussia is an army that has a country, where nearly every young man who lives in Prussia is expected to serve in some capacity in the Prussian military. So the 30 Years' War sees the emergence of a powerful Austrian state coming out of the Holy Roman Empire, and also the emergence of the powerful Prussian state coming out of the Holy Roman Empire. 1648 will mark the end of the religious wars era on the continent, but not in Britain, because in 1648, Britain is in the middle of fighting a brutal civil war, which we will learn about later. So here's a map of Europe in 1648 with the Treaty of Westphalia, the Peace of Westphalia. And hopefully at the end of all this, you get a strong sense of what the causes of the 30 Years' War were and what the consequences are of this horrible conflict. There's a lot of little nitty-gritty details with the 30 Years' War, a wide variety of players in the 30 Years' War. But that's it. I'm very curious to know what questions that you have. But this ends my lecture on the 30 Years' War. I do, however, before I conclude, finally, I do have one little story that I would like to share about the 30 Years' War. So here's one last final story that I want to tell about the 30 Years' War, and it has to do with a personal experience of mine. I grew up in Upper Arlington, same community that you're growing up in. And like you, probably, you just get familiar with, the architecture of a place, the feel of a place, the way people interact with each other. But then I graduated from high school, and I'd studied German when I was in high school. I went to college, and I still had to take 1 year of German to satisfy my foreign language requirement. Lucky for me, though, the college that I went to provided me with an opportunity to study German for 1 month in Germany. And a lot of you have had or will have the opportunity to study abroad. It's a fantastic thing. So I was 19 years old. I was a college freshman, and I left for Germany. And it was the very first time that I got to leave the country. And we flew to Frankfurt, and then from Frankfurt, I got on a train with me and my class. My class had, I think, 6 or 7 students and a professor in it. I mean, it was a class, but it was just really a small group of American college kids. And we went by train from Frankfurt, Germany to a town called Rothenburg ob der Tauber. I couldn't see the town when we got in because we got in late, and we just checked into the more like a bed and breakfast type of place where we stayed. I went to bed, crashed out, woke up in the morning, and I was kind of had one of those moments where like, where am I? And I opened my eyes. I was like, oh yeah, I'm in Germany. And I looked out the window, and having grown up in Upper Arlington, it didn't prepare me for looking at a town that seemed to be frozen in the Middle Ages. Rothenburg ob der Tauber looks like this. This is the town of Rothenburg ob der Tauber as it looks today. It's like something out of a fairy tale. It's a town frozen in time, which is probably exactly why a lot of tourists from the United States go there. Now, one of the reasons why Rothenburg ob der Tauber looks like this is because the town went into a period of steep economic decline because of the 30 Years' War and because of a plague that hit soon thereafter. There simply wasn't much commercial activity in Rothenburg ob der Tauber, so it just stayed a small town. So there's this great legend about Rothenburg ob der Tauber from the 30 Years' War, and the legend goes something like this. Count Tilly and the Bavarian army showed up to the town. They are there Wallenstein style to take over the town and take whatever they want to eat, steal whatever it is they want to steal, do to the people whatever it is they want to do to them. But, as I understand the legend, Count Tilly stood before the councilmen of the city and placed in front of them a small keg of beer. It was either beer or wine, I don't remember. I'm not sure if it matters. But anyway, a small keg of alcohol. And Tilly told the councilmen, if one of you can drink this, then we won't sack the town, knowing that no individual could drink all that alcohol. But one of the city councilmen stepped forward and said, I can do it, drank the contents of this small keg, then fell over dead, sacrificing himself to save his beloved town of Rothenburg ob der Tauber. And this particular event is commemorated annually in a festival in Rothenburg ob der Tauber. This festival is called Der Meistertrunk, where the people of Rothenburg dress up just like their ancestors dressed in the early 17th century, and they celebrate their town being saved, and I think they have quite a bit of a party. That was not a party that I was there to witness when I was a 19-year-old college kid, but I did get to hear the story, and that was actually the first time I ever got to learn about the 30 Years' War. That was my introduction to the 30 Years' War. I hadn't studied it before then, and I really didn't know what it was all about. But I hope you guys know what it's about, and I hope you enjoyed learning about it, and I certainly look forward to your questions and comments about my presentation of the 30 Years' War. That's it for this lecture. Thanks, Eurobears. Have a wonderful day.